Heidi-ho, and how does it go? Neffertity here with another fantastic and fabulous tutorial. I know recently I did a Supermotion canine tail tutorial, but this time around I've brought you a fabulous feline tail. This one is designed for a bit of a larger, more feral character, but it would work just as well for a house cat if you wanted a tail that kind of drooped down more like a tiger tail. And speaking of which, tiger tails, stripes. Oh my goodness, this project was a heck of a long one, and I did chop up the video footage a lot to save you the hassle. When I get into sewing the stripes of this character's tail, it took me probably 6 days just to do the stripes alone, and that would have been ludicrous amounts of editing footage and so much video to go through. So please forgive me for not including cutting out every single one of the 54 stripes on this tail. I promise it's the same process as sewing any other markings. They're just tiny and intricate. If you would like to purchase the pattern that I used in this tutorial, it is available on my website, artbyneffertity.com/store, and you can find a direct link to it down in the description below. Of course, you don't have to, but you're more than welcome to do so if you would like to use this exact pattern. If not, you can always generally reference what I'm doing because the shape itself is fairly simple. But with all that stuff out of the way, we can go ahead and dive directly into this tutorial. Okay, so the very first thing that I'm going to do is take my 3-inch polyurethane foam that I picked up from Home Depot, and I have transferred the pattern that is available on my website onto some newspaper so that I could draw all the individual little markings on this tail, because there are a lot of little markings on this particular commission, and I did not want to get them confused or waste my primary master pattern. Once I have this main pattern transferred onto the foam, I'm then going to make this little section here where I intend to remove that bit of foam. I don't want the whole tail to be solid because this is going to be a very large tail, and I wanted to make sure that the bottom had a nice bob and sway to it. And since it'll be mostly short fur, I wanted to really emphasize that, so I'm just keeping that little bit cut off. You can do solid foam for the whole tail and it shouldn't make much of a difference. I leveled off any inconsistencies, and now I'm just going to be taking some of my 1-inch foam to make these little gumdrop shapes. And these are simply just to pad out the base of the tail and make a little bit more of an organic transition between human butt and furry tail. Because otherwise it just looks too skinny and too uniform by itself, and it just makes it look a little bit odd, you know? This isn't included in the pattern, it's not necessary, especially if you're doing like an indoor house cat tail, you want it to all be one singular shape. But because this is for someone who's a little bit on the larger side, I wanted to make sure that it was going to match their body proportions correctly. Hence why I'm taking this little bit of an extra step to pad out the base of the tail to make the transition more natural. Carve the shapes and make sure that you saturate them thoroughly with glue. Place them down on the tail and let them dry thoroughly. Once I apply the first one, I usually flip it over, apply glue to the second part, stick that sucker down, wait till everything dries, and I mean wait till everything dries. You cannot rush this next part. You have to wait. Once it has fully dried, you can then move on to the next part, which is probably one of the most vital and most annoying parts, but if you have an electric carving knife, this will be way easier. We can't have that one solid block of foam because it just looks chunky and not realistic, and I don't know the last time you saw a feline that had a box for a tail. So we need to carve it down and make it into a more smooth, organic shape. I start by taking large tapered edges off here, just making sure that all 4 sides get this so that they're less of a box shape and more of, I guess, icosphere is the kind of shape I'm going for. And then I go back over and I repeat this exact step with all the new edges I just created, including smoothing down that piece of 1-inch foam that I put on either side to check the depth and thickness of the whole tail. You can do this with scissors by hand, but it will take forever and you will have an insane mess when you're done. Take regular breaks and be patient. I've practiced a lot with my carving tool, so I am very proficient at using it, and I can get very delicate little cuts like this. Whereas if I use my scissors, it takes a very long time, it makes a huge mess, and it tends to strain my hands to the point where I need to put braces on them because the muscle strain is just awful. So I really cannot stress this enough. when carving and smoothing details on any kind of costumery, not just fursuits. Cosplayers do this too, especially when working with EVA foam. Always, always, always make sure that you are taking regular breaks. You don't want that muscle strain. That stuff sucks, trust me. Take your time, smooth everything out, and it'll make the end product look so much better. You can see here I take a little bit more off the base to taper it. You're working with a three-dimensional object, so make sure you flip it over. Next, I'm going to section off these parts of the tail because this is what makes the super motion work. Here I'm cutting into it and just taking out, I want to say like about a 1/4 inch at the base, and then it gets gradually smaller and smaller in the depth before eventually I go ahead and I just make direct cuts in the foam and I don't remove any excess. You don't want to take off too much when you're closer to the tip and lower half of the spine because the weight will pull the tail into a straight position, which often affects the appearance and makes it look icky, you know? It doesn't quite look right. Be sure and test the movement every now and again and see if it needs any more cuts to increase the mobility. Once you've got to that point, we're now ready to install the belt. The way that I do this is usually about 2 to 3 inches into the base itself. I make a little mark and then cut with my scissors directly through the foam until I have a clear channel that goes all the way through. I'm then going to take a piece of this, I believe it's 1/2 inch floor mat foam. It's also called EVA foam, exercise mat foam. You can find it just about everywhere. I usually pick mine up from either Home Depot or Walmart. Insert on this little rectangular chunk and trim off any excess, and then apply some glue only to the front portion of that. Leave the back open. We don't want to clear that channel completely. We just want to make sure that that front is secure. Using that same foam, I'm also going to go ahead and trace with my marker to make the end cap for the tail. This is the part that sits on your bum, and you want this part to remain nice and rigid like this so that the tail doesn't compress and slump over time. That was one of the biggest things that I encountered when making tails for the very first time, was that too many people just stick elastic on the tail and say, yep, good enough, that works. But that's not what you want. You want to make sure that it stays on your body and it doesn't look like it's attached to a belt. It should look like it's a tail attached to your spine, right? At least that's the way I've always looked at it. Speaking of elastic, I have some really thick, I believe it's 2-inch elastic here that I'm applying glue on the main parts of the tail, sticking down, making sure that I avoid the parts where the little cuts are so that it is able to flex and bend. This usually isn't necessary, but with a really long tail like this, I do recommend adding them because it gives it a sense of stability and helps it keep its shape longer. I know that once I fur this tail, it's going to be a little bit on the heavy side, so I do want to make sure that this tail doesn't end up slumping over. Carefully apply glue on both ends and wait till it thoroughly dries before moving on to the next step.
There's a distance between us.
Make sure you test it every now and again just to see how it fits, as well as checking the movement. If it looks like it needs a little bit more cuts or anything like that, you can go ahead and add them. Sometimes you can add more beads for weight distribution. If you need more elastic for stability, you can do that. And also, make sure that it doesn't drag on the ground. The whole point of a supermotion tail is that it stays off the ground. It should be bouncy, but it should also have enough of a rigid shape to it that it hangs on tightly to your body. At that point, you're now ready to work on your pattern. For me here, because the pattern is so complex, I transferred it onto my newspaper and now I'm just cutting out each of the individual parts. Normally I would cut out all the pieces at once, but because this is such a complex design, I wanted to cut out each part individually so that I didn't get lost with all the pieces. I often get asked what kind of furs I use, where I buy them, materials, all that stuff. You can always find all the materials that I use linked in the description below. My personal recommendation when it comes to furs is, of course, Howl Fabrics because I adore their quality. That particular long white is their Flocati Fox, which has a very nice long shag to it. The texture is not exactly desirable. It's a little bit more coarse than regular luxury shag, but I'm willing to sacrifice the softness for that beautiful bounce on the end of a tail. I just think it looks so cute. I gave it a good brush out, brush the carpet to pick up any loose fibers, making sure that every time you do cut fur, you're only cutting the backing to minimize how much it sheds. But I've noticed that this fur in particular sheds a lot when you cut it. Next, I'm using one of the navy blues from Howl Fabric in order to cut this next little marking portion here. Generally with darker furs, I would use a silver Sharpie or a silver Cricut marker to be able to mark things down because you can just wash that ink directly out. If you're ever using Sharpies to trace onto patterns and stuff, always make sure it is either a black, silver, or gold Sharpie and that you're going as light as possible with the ink. You do not want to saturate that or it will bleed when you eventually wash it. Now, after literal days of cutting pieces, this is what I was left with. 54 individual pieces for one tail. It is going to take a very long time, so I'm splitting it into segments to make it easier on myself and, of course, my sanity. After a full night of work, as you can tell by the camera lighting change, I have quite a few panels done here that have these fantastically clean markings, and the way that I did them was simply the blanket stitch. When it comes to small, intricate markings like these, I usually prefer to hand sew them over machine because I just feel much more accurate doing hand sewing and I can more easily correct a mistake if it occurs. The biggest thing to keep in mind is whenever you're hand sewing, you want your seam allowance to be about 1/4 of an inch, no more. How we're going to do it is just like this. I'll take these pieces and show you how to do that blanket stitch. I have the two pieces here cut out, and one thing I want to note is that the greenish malachite piece that you see, that fur, when I traced that inside edge, I added no seam allowance. When I traced and cut the black pieces, I added about 1/4 inch seam allowance. The whole point of doing this is to ensure that the marking fits properly and it doesn't distort or shift the pattern at all. I made that mistake in the past where I just added a little bit too much seam allowance and everything resulted in being very schlumpy and saggy because there was too much for the markings. To do your blanket stitch, you simply insert the needle with your double-tailed thread, and then as you saw there, before you pull it tight, you pass the needle back through the loop of thread. I usually loop it over the needle before I do a stitch to prevent it from getting snagged, and just repeat this step over and over and over again. The more you practice, the better you'll get. The biggest thing to also keep in mind with doing blanket stitches by hand is to keep them consistent. Same depth, same distance apart. You really don't want the stitches to be too far apart, otherwise you're going to notice big old gaps in your sewing and you're going to be much more prone to pop seams. I can usually stress out my seams like this pretty extensively without it causing problems. So this works really well for me, especially when it comes to intricate and small details, because they always seem to lay nice and flat after I'm done, thanks to this consistency of the stitches, versus if I just give seam allowance on both ends and work my way all the way down, it ends up with this bumpy ridge that makes the furs look like they're two separate pieces instead of one solid marking like this. After literally 6 days of hand sewing, I was left with 2 complete sides of this tail. The amount of markings on this are astronomical, but I really wanted to go the extra mile here and make absolutely sure that all these details would be permanent and no airbrushing would fade, so I went through and hand sewed every single one. With both halves done, I can now go ahead and pin both halves together to get ready to sew them. Holy moly, that's a lot of pins! My clips are great, they make my brain so happy. I love these super clips, they are fantastic. You can find them linked down in the description as well. Once everything is all pinned, I set my machine to the zigzag stitch. Make sure that I reverse the thread before I begin so it has a nice secured setting. and then slowly work my way down this tail to prevent any distortions of these markings. Because they are so intricate, I did not want them to get distorted at all. This does require a lot more patience, and this video footage has been sped up by probably about 1,000 times, because in reality, I am going insanely slow. Like, that needle was barely moving, it was so slow. It took me probably, I want to say, like a good 2 hours just to sew around the tail because of how slow I went. But I was happy I did so because the accuracy really mattered, and I wanted to make sure none of those markings got messed up so that they would be all janked and slid sideways. I find a lot of newer fursuit makers want to get the thing done as fast as possible so they don't take their time with it and it affects the quality in the end. So my advice to you is take your time with it. Try not to rush. You'll appreciate the end product so much more if you took your time to make sure every little detail was nice and perfect. Once both halves are done, we're now ready to turn this big ol' long tube inside out. To make this easier on yourself to put it onto the actual foam, I recommend just turning the tip of the tail inside out first, and then putting it on kind of like you would a compression sock if you've ever had to use those. You just make a little hole, turn the part inside out, and then take the end of the foam tail and stick it in. And then you begin the wrestling match.
Let's get ready to rumble! Y'all ready for this?
In retrospect, I probably should have made a duct tape pattern for this tail and then sewed all the pieces together to have prevented how snug this was, because it was a pretty darn snug fit, which in the end wasn't an issue. The tail still functioned just fine, but it was a struggle to get it onto the foam base. So take it from my personal experience. If you're doing a foam pattern and you're working with foam, make sure you go the extra step and do a duct tape pattern instead of just transferring it directly from the fabric, because it was snug. With that done, I then went to work making the end cap for this tail. I only included this footage to kind of explain how I did this. You can also check my canine tail to see how I attach this portion here. It's just made of a fabric stabilizer that I've sewed a piece of decorative fabric onto. I ended up changing this part out in the end because the client wanted me to do a gore detail after all. Changing it out was not really too much of an issue, it was quick, but I just baseball stitch all the way around, and once that's done, the tail itself is actually complete. You'll have these nice clean edges here that'll sit flush with your human body so that nobody has to see that, but it's just pretty to look at. And of course the hidden belt hole that I showed how to do in the previous tutorial. I do plan to make a full tutorial for that by itself. Was gonna do it on this one, but after working on it for 6 days straight, my sanity left me, so. The whole point of the hidden belt is that you can set the tail down on the bed and kind of snuggle with it if you wanted to, and when you do want to actually wear it, you simply thread a belt through the hole, and that way it can attach to your human body. I like these leather belts that I picked up from Walmart because they have lots of adjustability and they tend to fit everybody of all sizes. They hold the tail nice and firmly, and it just works really nicely. Plus it's removable, so yay, tail snuggles! And here is the finished tail. I was really happy with the movement on this one, and especially all those details. I'm still learning airbrushing myself, but I much prefer hand-sewn markings anyway because they don't fade over time like airbrushing does. And this particular tail worked phenomenally well with the character that it's being made for. It sits very close to the body, it has a fun little bob to it when you walk, you can shake and it swings around, but it still stays close enough to your body that you won't ever have to worry about it colliding with anything. And that about wraps it up for this video. Now, I did have a really cool end screen full of a bunch of fan art and my Patreon screen and all that fun stuff, but I installed a new graphics card in my computer, and apparently when I did that, the computer said, I think I'm just gonna corrupt that entire end segment, and I have not had enough time to refilm it. I've refilmed it probably 4 times and had to re-edit the same thing, and the program crashed every time, so I'm a little stressed, to say the least. Technology has problems at times, and unfortunately this just happened to be one of the times that pushed this video back by a good, I want to say like almost a good 2 weeks now. So I do apologize, but there won't be an end screen with the Patreon support and the fan art on this particular video, but I do promise in the next one that I do, I will pick up and I will work on doing that again. I'm just gonna wrap things up quickly before things have a chance to fail horrendously again, so thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it and found it educational, and as always, I hope you have a wonderful day and a fantastic life. You, sir. Skadooch. Go that way.